Welcome back to the Chasing Happiness podcast, an honest podcast about finding happiness, what it really means, and the process of getting there. My name is Crystal, and this week on the podcast, we're going to talk about ACEs. And no, for all of you listening, I don't mean the ACEs that come in a card deck. What I'm actually talking about is something called adverse childhood experiences. Now you may be asking yourself, what is that? What does that mean? Well, this was a study that was conducted to see whether or not adverse childhood experiences would have an impact on lifelong health, opportunity, violence, all of those sorts of things. And without getting into too much of the details, what I'm going to tell you is the study actually found that for children who had any adverse childhood experiences, there could be, and I say could because in science it is always hard to find a direct correlation or cause for things because circumstances are different for everyone, right? Life is different for everyone, so you can't always 100% say this is the reason this has happened. What we can say is it is likely based on the statistics and the outcomes that this is the reason for X. So basically what this study found was that for children who have more of these adverse childhood experiences, they actually have a tremendous amount of impact on lifelong health, opportunity, violence, victimization, and perpetration, which is kind of a big deal. And you're probably thinking like, why does this even matter? Well, it matters for a couple of reasons, and we will get into that. But the most important reason why it matters is because we have all lived very complicated lives, depending on who you are and where you're from. And if you don't understand how the stress of going through the complicated life that you've lived could be impacting your overall health or your overall ability to function on a day-to-day basis, then you may not actually fully understand the damage that can be caused by such things. So in this study, for adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, there's about 20 questions, maybe 22, I can't remember the exact number, but there's a handful of questions that you go through. And these are events that have to occur from the age of 0 to 17, because we are looking at childhood, not adulthood. And the questions can vary from things about emotional abuse to physical abuse, sexual abuse, but there's also questions just as simple as, do your parents suffer from a mental illness? Did somebody in your home suffer from a mental illness? Did someone in your immediate family go to jail at some point? All kinds of different things that we don't necessarily always associate with a trauma that actually may have been experienced in the child as a trauma. Did you move around a lot when you were a kid? Did your parents verbally abuse each other? Did something happen to your parents and you had to be raised by a different caregiver? If you're ever curious about the actual questions, feel free to just go to Google and type in adverse childhood experiences and you'll get access to the quiz. Make sure you're pulling it up from a reputable source, obviously, but you can certainly take the quiz if you so desire to. ACEs actually are pretty common in about 61% or so of the adults that they studied when they did this study, which I thought was pretty interesting. Most of us are going to have some in our life. It's just a matter of how many did you have? How long did those circumstances last in your life? And how much of that stress hormone that we talk about so regularly did your body get used to living with on a regular basis? So 61% of the adults that they studied said they had at least one ACE in their childhood, but 1 in 6 people who were studied had 4 or more. And the reason that's relevant is because having one ACE may not have huge adverse effects on your lifetime overall, but people with 4 or more have a much higher risk of injury, STDs, teen pregnancy, cancers, heart disease, diabetes, suicide, and other things that we don't necessarily associate with trauma from our childhood because they happen while we're adults. Now, the study can't say for sure that absolutely the reason you became pregnant when you were a teen is because, a parent of yours went to jail. What they can say is that it's more likely, based on the fact that you have a bunch of different ACEs, that you were put in a different position as a teenager. Maybe you weren't educated about teen pregnancy. Maybe something happened in your life and you wanted to get out of the situation you were in, so you became a mom to be able to have your own life. There are all these things that we can't really specifically get into, but it is interesting that for the people in this study who had 4 or more, they were at a higher risk of simple things like just regular injury in everyday life, heart disease, diabetes. And that's not just based on living conditions, obviously. Eating well, exercising, these are all things that have a bearing on that. But the level of stress hormone in your body over an extended period of time also contributes to these health issues. If you're a person who has a high ACE score and you also lived below the poverty line or in an underserviced or under-resourced area, your risk of being exposed to that level of stress hormone, or what we call toxic stress, can actually change the development of your brain and your ability to make decisions appropriately, your ability to deal with stress in a healthy way. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because at some point or another, we are all exposed to stress as a kid. The world is a complicated place. Our parents are complicated people. That's going to sooner or later mean that stress has happened to us. But how bad has that stress been? Has it been toxic throughout our whole childhood? Or were there just a couple of events here and there? Did we move once every 10 years? Or did we move 3 times every year like I did? Those are very stressful things for kids. So the reason that it matters is we need to know, 1, how much stress we're dealing with. 2, whether or not that gives us the ability to sort of reframe how we handle stress as adults. If you're someone who has a high ACE score, you may not have the functionality or the ability to deal with stress appropriately. So you have to start to get help. You have to reach out to people who can help teach you how to appropriately do that. Different things like, obviously, we talk about meditation and yoga and things like that to help reduce our stress. But also other things like simply knowing you had a lot of ACEs as a child, so you're at a higher risk for heart disease and diabetes. So not only are you going to eat well and exercise, but you're also going to go to regular doctor's checkups, have a physical every year to keep an eye on those things. So what can we do about it? Because obviously we can't go back into our childhood and change the fact that we've been exposed to all of these ACEs. But what we can do is become aware of how they're affecting us as adults, come up with strategies, whether that's by ourselves or with the help of professionals, to be able to deal with the stress that we have now in a more functional, healthier way. But we can also start to teach skills to our kids. If you're somebody who has kids and you know a stressful event is coming, whether that's, moving from one house to the other, or whether that's someone in your immediate family going to jail, or whether that's some sort of traumatic experience that has happened, you can teach your kids how to deal with those feelings, how to process those feelings, how to reduce stress, why it's important. Social emotional learning is very important. We can teach our kids how to date safely, how to have healthy sexual relationships, how to avoid things like teen pregnancy, why it matters. We need to promote in our communities, in our neighborhoods, social norms that help to protect against violence, and whether that's emotional or physical violence, any kind of violence and adversity, so that not only is the law involved from a legislative standpoint, but we create safe places for women and children who are in situations, men who are in situations that are verbally abusive, physically abusive, to be able to remove themselves from that situation in a healthy manner and get the help that they need so that they're not dealing with that kind of stress over a long period of time. Of course, as I said, we want to make sure that we're doing what we can from a healthcare perspective. So making sure that we're talking to our primary care doctors, figuring out ways that we can reduce stress as adults because we were exposed to so much stress as children. If somebody in your family has a substance abuse problem, getting them help, but also helping your kids understand what's going on in a healthy and meaningful way so that they're not immediately exposed to high levels of toxic stress. It's so important that we as adults pay attention, not just to our stress responses, but to why we have those stress responses, how we can make changes to those stress responses, and of course, how we can teach our children to have better outcomes than we have. Science and research are great things, and for those of you who listen to this podcast, you know I love myself a good research study, but it's only part of the answer. And even something as simple or as complicated as ACEs, this adverse childhood experience study, it can only tell us so much. So we have to be responsible for our own learning. We have to be responsible for monitoring ourselves. If you're somebody who had a lot of adverse childhood experiences, then you know you probably are at a higher risk, let's say for heart disease. So incorporate some things into your life to bring down your risk. If you're a smoker, stop smoking. If you don't exercise, go for a walk once or twice a week. Little changes can help us not be at such a great risk for some of these health issues from the childhood experiences that we had. But we have to be willing to take the steps. We have to be willing to acknowledge we went through something that may have affected us, not just mentally, but also physically. And how as adults can we make changes that will compensate for that? Also start to ask yourself, what can I do within my community? There are lots of children right now who are living through traumatic childhood experiences, adverse experiences. Is there something you can do? Can you get involved in a community program that gives them an outlet? Can you donate to your local shelter? Can you become a big brother or a big sister so that some child has a positive influence in their life to help them learn how to reduce stress and enjoy life and find all of the joy and happiness that they possibly can? There are a lot of things in life that we don't have control over, but thankfully as adults, when we learn that things have had an impact on us, both physically and emotionally, we have the ability to make some changes to compensate for those things, at least a little bit. So I challenge you this week to think about those things. I challenge you to incorporate some form of stress reduction in your regular life. And I know a bunch of you are thinking, oh my God, how much more stress reduction could I possibly incorporate? And for some of you, that's absolutely true. But for others, something as simple as a little more physical activity, drinking a little bit more water, finding space to meditate, all of these things can help our overall health. I thank you guys for listening to the podcast. I hope you're having a great week. If you love the podcast, please feel free to share it with someone. Please also rate us on iTunes. It helps people to be able to find the podcast in the list of 9 million podcasts that are going on in the world right now. I thank you guys. I appreciate you guys for showing up every week. And I hope you have an absolutely wonderful week this week. Next week, I have an interview for you guys. On Monday, the podcast episode is going to be about MS. So I hope you come back and you listen to that. So have a great week, everyone. And I will chat with you guys next week. Bye for now.